so now let's talk about how do we help. We talked about all the problems. Okay, so let's turn our attitudes to something a little bit more positive. Talk about how we can make this better. So conservation biologists really have two different approaches to this issue of biodiversity. You can either focus on populations that are small and are, as a consequence of being small, being very vulnerable. If you're going to do that, usually the biodiversity has already been lost because the population is already small. You can also focus on populations that are declining but aren't yet small. So one of them is like reacting to small populations, and the other one is trying to prevent the populations from shrinking in the first place. Neither one of these is necessarily better. It's just two different approaches to the same problem. So again, why are small populations so vulnerable? Well, again, over-harvesting, habitat loss, inbreeding, genetic drift, all of these things are a problem for small populations. These factors are what made the population small in the first place. It turns into this kind of, we call it the extinction vortex. It's like a downward spiral, the death spiral of a species. Because it shows this to you here. If you are a small population, you're more subject to the problems of genetic drift. We learned that back in Unit 6. Well, if genetic drift is an issue, that means you've lost a lot of genetic variability. If you've lost the genetic variability, you have a lesser ability to respond to your environment, which means individual fitness has gone down, which means you have a lower reproductive rate and a higher mortality, which is going to make your population even smaller yet, and the cycle continues over and over and over until eventually the population is actually extinct. So small populations go into this extinction vortex that's really very dangerous. So the question is, how small does a population have to be before it gets to this extinction vortex? Well, it depends on the type of organism, how fast it reproduces, what its range is, and how likely it is to be killed. All populations require some kind of minimum population size. We call that an MVP, minimum viable population, at which it can sustain its numbers. But similar to being endangered or threatened, I can't tell you a particular number that a population has to be in order to be considered healthy. It's going to be different for different species. And so computer programs take all these different variables in. How big is your area? How much territory do you need? How much food are you eating? How many babies do you have? And what's your time scale for that? Computer programs figure it out specifically and help scientists figure out where that threshold is for an MVP. But that total size of a population could actually be misleading. Only certain members of the population breed successfully, and so instead we might look at the effective population size. Because if we're having a lot of trouble with the younger individuals being successful, and our population is aging, the older individuals are probably not reproducing anymore. And so looking at the total population is often not insightful. So instead we might look at the effective population size, the EPS, which is based on that breeding potential of a population rather than the population size itself. Both of these measures stem from a concern that populations have to maintain enough diversity to adapt as their environment changes. But conservation biologists might instead try to intervene before we get to that point of having too small of a population. This is going to focus on the threatened and endangered species, not waiting until they get to that critically endangered term. Then in these species that would be showing a downward trend, even if the population is far above that MVP value. This is going to emphasize environmental factors that are causing a decline in the first place. For example, my red-headed woodpecker, turns out that the population was threatened, or the species was threatened, and the populations were decreasing sharply due to loss of habitat. Biologists figured out what was key about the habitat. This was an ideal habitat, and this is where the scientists wanted them to live, but they were no longer living. What they found out was that because we were also preventing forest fires from kind of clearing stuff out every once in a while, there was way too much undergrowth, and the woodpeckers didn't like to live in places where there was too much undergrowth. They also learned that it takes the woodpeckers several years to create a nest. Apparently that's a lot of work. So the scientists went in, cut down the shrubbery, returned the environment to the natural state, and then drilled little starter nests into trees. They drilled little 20 little holes in trees, the size of a starter nest for the birds. Did not bring in any birds, but just set it up for the birds in a way that they thought would be ideal. A year later, 18 of the 20 fake nests were inhabited. There were no new nests, but 18 of the 20 were inhabited. And then the next year, they had new nests being built. So the scientists learned that in essence, the birds just needed help to get started. But once we gave them an opportunity to get started and reestablish that habitat that was ideal for them, they could take it from there. So it's just addressing the root problem rather than the result of the problem. So the last thing I want to just talk about is why is this so hard? Why is conservation biology so difficult? The reality is we can't save every species. Okay? It's not possible. But remember when we were talking about keystone species, and we were saying how there are some that are just more important to the health of an ecosystem than others? We have to find those, and when those are starting to struggle, and when those species are starting to decline, those are the ones that we have to prioritize. We have to prioritize those keystone species that have more of an impact on the environment and the ecosystems than others. We have to figure out what's most important for conservation and prioritize our efforts there. Okay, so that's where we're going to end. Perfect. So I told you we only had a few more.